Okay, so we are talking about the status of the internal audit department, right? So what is the status? The status of the internal audit department. What do you mean by the status? We are looking at, when we say the status of the internal audit department, we are referring to the objectivity, you know, what is their status in terms of their integrity? That's what we are referring to here. So we are looking at the objectivity of this IA department or internal audit department. We're also looking at their professional competence. You know, their professional competence. Who are these people who are in internal audit? You know, what kind of experience do they have? What kind of qualifications do they have? Yeah. It's very, very important. It's very, very important. Okay. Then you also have another consideration is that there will also need to be effective communication between external and internal auditors. You know, if you decide to use the work of internal auditors, it means that there's going to be that collaboration. You know, and so that collaboration must be there, that communication must be there, and that ability to communicate must be there, because you will notify each other of, you know, any matters, you know, any matters arising, you know, the external auditor will bring it to the internal auditor's attention. Any question on this slide? Any question on this slide?
My question is the first point as to using the work of the internal auditors. What the external auditor needs to consider. The first one, the status of the internal, the objectivity of the internal audit department. In practice, how are you able to assess the integrity of the internal audit? It's just something that was the question I was asking in my mind when we got to that point.
Okay, that's a good question. So let me throw the question back to you. How do you think you assess the integrity of management? How do you think the auditor does that? Do you have an idea? Hello.
I don't have an idea, but I just want to try.
Okay. Oh, let's
maybe
try.
By having a discussion with management to find out management's point of view of issues. Yeah. Is that a fair point?
Okay, that's a fair point. Does anyone have an idea? How do you, it's a good question that I asked. I just want to see what you.
Well, if it's not the first time.
Hello.
Okay. After I heard another person talking, so after Caleb.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
I was saying you can assess the objectivity of the internal audit department by examining examining the independence of the internal audit department. For example, whether the internal audit department reports to the audit committee or it reports to, let's say, the management, the finance director. So if it reports to the audit committee instead, then you know that they are more independent, so their decisions will be more objective. and then you can also assess its status or its objectivity in the sense that when reports are made, like if the internal audit department, they make recommendations on certain things that management are supposed to do. If management take up these recommendations, you can rely more on this thing. But if management is not really taking these recommendations by the internal audit, then you can the independence is kind of compromised. So you check that one too.
Okay, those are very good points. Very, very good point. Okay, Caleb. I'm using that so that I come to how to assess objectivity of the internal audit department. Because it's quite similar. That's why I'm doing that. Okay, go ahead.
So, if it's not if it's a recurring audit engagement, that's not the first time the auditor has audited the client. They can use, first of all, the internal controls of the organization, because it's the auditors that help management put in basically good internal controls. Also, has my colleague also made mention of how they communicate, or their reporting structure. That is, they also need to know who they report to, or who they report to, and how they take their reports. However, if it's a more or less like a new organization that you're going to audit, then basically is also going to look at again, you can also look at the internal controls. However, you can also talk to probably the chief internal auditor and discuss how matters are being resolved. For instance, okay, you can put to the floor that, okay, how, if there's an issue with revenue, what was put in place, and due to probably your experience in certain firms, how they take those issues. So you can also take a look at that.
So I think you guys have answered the question already. So you do that, you assess the to my friend's question, you assess the is it objectivity? Yeah, objectivity of the internal audit department through several ways. Number one, is it objectivity and competence, whatever you want to, objectivity, competence. One, structure. Structure talks a lot about competence, right? So the reason why you don't feel comfortable when you go to a public institution because you don't see any structure there. Some of the public institutions is just a mess. You don't know who is assistant. They are just there, and there's one boss. So where the structure and the reporting lines haven't been clearly defined, it's likely to reflect in the kind of work they do, because there's no system, there's no structure to manage the way the work is done. I think Caleb and the other gentleman mentioned that, but in a different way. So that's one. Number two is you assess them by you look at the facts on ground, right? One of the things that so you need to understand, as an external auditor, what are the responsibilities of an internal auditor? There are certain things that they are responsible for. Okay. And some of those things, they are facts on ground. So one of them is the controls, right? The internal audit team is supposed to look at the processes of the organization, perform audits, and they are very, very key in helping to design controls that would help the organization. So you look at those controls, like they say, right? The way you're able to observe the mechanic is good is that was he able to fix the car? So you look at those controls, look at the way those controls are, designed and the way they operate. And you can tell that, the internal audit team, there's a problem or there's no problem. So sometimes when auditors go into an organization, they look into, in practice, they look at the internal audit team. Sometimes it's only one person. So that's about the structure. It's only one person in a big organization doing everything. So you can tell that it's either this one person handling the whole internal audit. It's either this person is going to be pressured and might make mistakes as a result. It's not very, so it sends a signal. These are signals that the auditors pick. Sometimes they look at the controls, they ask questions and they look at the controls and they're able to tell how competent they are. Another thing that one of our friends raised, which I thought was very, very key, is how independent they are, right? So you don't want an internal audit team that is easily influenced. So there's a reason why they report to the audit committee and they get, so you don't want an internal audit team that is easily influenced, so that when the management is doing something fishy, the internal audit team will cover it. So you want an internal audit team that is a bit independent or semi-independent so that they can easily run audits, just the same way an external auditor is independent in an organization. You want that for, and if that independence is compromised, competence, objectivity, all those things are compromised. I hope I answered your question. Did I answer your question? Is he still online? Okay, I think I answered the question. I don't know. If I didn't answer, just let me know. Now let's move on to using the work of using the work of internal auditors. We're still talking about it, right? Because the external auditor is fully responsible for the audit opinion, you need to test the work performed by the internal auditors. So in practice, what happens is that, so this is also another way that they can check the objectivity, competence, or whatever. When the external auditor is relying on the internal auditor's work, he doesn't swallow, that's what I was trying to say. They don't swallow everything hook, line, and sinker, right? It's like they retest. It's like remarking, right? Somebody writes an exam, an examiner marks, then another examiner marks again. So they get the work of the internal auditor and they test the work that has been performed by the internal auditors. Before using specific work of internal audits, the external auditor is required to evaluate whether the work was performed by internal auditors with adequate training and proficiency. So who is performing the work? Does the person have the training? Is the person proficient enough to be able to handle the work? Another thing is that, was the work supervised properly? Was the work supervised properly? So you want to understand whether the work was supervised. Was the work supervised properly? If it wasn't supervised, then who is catching the errors in the work? Another thing that the auditor also evaluates, whether appropriate conclusions have been reached and whether adequate audit evidence was obtained. It's very, very important. Then if there are any exceptions, or unusual matters, that is something the auditor really takes note of. So how does this, so I put up a small note down there. If you see, I said procedures to achieve this, procedures to achieve this is by examining items already examined by internal audits, which we already talked about, testing the work performed by internal auditors, then examining other similar items as well, and observing procedures performed by internal audits. So these are some procedures that auditors can engage in. Now, to determine the planned effects of the work of internal audit on the nature, timing, and extent of the procedures, the external auditor is required to, again, like when we are talking about auditors experts, we mentioned the nature and scope of specific work performed or to be performed by the internal audit. You know, well, what is the work? What is the nature of the work? What is the scope of the work? It's very, very important. It's very, very important. What is the scope of the work? What is the nature of the work? That's very, very, very key. It's very, very key. Again, you see here the risk of material misstatements. The risk of material misstatements. I hope you can see that. I said that it's very, very key. The risk of material misstatements. Then, because it's the work of an internal audit, and the internal audits, they are kind of like in the organization, you know, we need to check the degree of subjectivity involved in the evaluation of evidence gathered by internal audit. Is there any subjectivity? Because even though these internal audit people are supposed to be like semi-independent, they are still in the organization. So the auditor would try to see like what the degree of subjectivity involved, you know, in the evaluation of evidence that is gathered by the internal audit. Now, let's talk about ISA 540. Let's talk about ISA 540, which is the nature of accounting estimates and the audit problem. Now, we've talked about estimates. And when we are going through the past questions, you saw estimates. Estimates being, I'm sorry, I feel like sneezing. You saw estimates being talked about, right? Being talked about. So